right, folks. So, Tucker Carlson recently interviewed a popular historian named Darryl Cooper. Darryl Cooper has been described as Blackwater meets Oktoberfest. That's how
Yeah.
you should think of Darryl Cooper. And
Well,
so
that's
I'm
what
going to
it
let.
says on his Twitter profile, right?
Yeah, that's in his bio. Blackwater meets Oktoberfest. Russell, go ahead. Take this away.
Okay, so Darryl Cooper, a self-described popular historian, did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and the portion of it that got the most attention was his contention that Winston Churchill was the real villain of World War II, and some of his theories about the decisions that the Nazis made in the East. So this is just a quick segment.
Be stupid, be a smarty. Come and join the Nazi party.
Oh, hang on. That wasn't that was later in the interview. That's later in the interview. I didn't mean to drop that yet. Okay, so Tucker Carlson's favorite historian has repeatedly suggested Hitler wasn't so bad. Now, we got a little pushback on a tweet. We just actually put out that video, and a lot of people are saying no, he's not sympathetic to Nazis. He has dropped some really interesting tweets, I will say. So here's somebody had tweeted out a picture of Mussolini and Hitler, saying these two humans were responsible for the death of millions. Centralization of power is never a good idea, never. Which seems like a reasonable enough thing that you wouldn't feel a need to respond to. But he did. Here are but a few examples where centralized power would have been very welcome. As the Arab proverb goes, 1,000 years of tyranny is preferable to a single day of anarchy. And then he, I guess, Wikipedia'd some civil wars. So then this one's pretty interesting. Now, I was not myself. We covered the Olympics opening ceremony on the Rumble side, as we had to do. I felt that it was very self-indulgent to take a ceremony that's intended for people all around the world and to insert gender ideology that's particular to certain wealthy Western countries that most of the world rejects. So I was not a fan of it. But wow, he really wasn't a fan of it. So this may be putting it too crudely for some, but the picture on the left was infinitely preferable in virtually every way than the one on the right. And the one on the left, as you can see, is Hitler and his band in front of the Eiffel Tower. And he feels that was better than the Olympic opening ceremony. Then here, if you're having a bad day, just remember that the Trump shooter is currently wandering around hell looking for Hitler, while the two guys Kyle Rittenhouse dropped figure out how to break the news for him, presumably the news being that Hitler did not go to hell. And yet many people seem to be claiming that calling him a Nazi sympathizer is just corporate media propaganda or something. I'm not quite clear on what the argument is, but it seems like he's telling you pretty openly that he thinks Hitler's a righteous dude.
Yeah, no, I mean, look,
Who would
Darryl
not
Cooper.
go to hell. While the guys Kyle Rittenhouse dropped would. And hey, I mean, the guys Kyle Rittenhouse dropped were not good guys, but one doesn't really have anything to do with the other.
He keeps a
So
DVD copy of Schindler's List in his sock drawer so his wife won't find it. Doesn't want to have to explain that to her.
he really likes that shower scene.
Yes.
Which
David Cooper's favorite sex position is the curb stomp. Did you guys know that?
Yeah, I still haven't found anyone who can explain to me why Spielberg shot that with like that gauzy lens with the Vaseline on the lens.
Yeah.
All right, so Tucker did an interview with him, and he prefaced it saying Darryl Cooper may be the best and most honest popular historian in the United States. His latest project is the most forbidden of all. trying to understand World War II. You know, this just it ruined Swanson TV dinners for me, Tucker. All right, so let's see how Mr. Cooper opens.
Talking about the interwar period.
Okay, so here in his setup, he talks about the issue that he has with how the Nazi era is framed in regards to the German people.
If you start talking about the interwar period and how the Weimar culture, you know, after the First World War led to something like the rise of the National Socialists, and why the people who embraced that movement did embrace it in a way that's not just, you know, was because they were, you know, you had this country, Germany, a sophisticated cultural, you know, superpower that was fine. And then they all turned into demons for a few years and now they're fine again. Like, that's sort of the official story. And I think deep down, we all know that makes no sense.
Oh, okay, so maybe that's the official story down at the feed store. I don't know where you live exactly. I don't know where
Official
Daryl
story
Cooper
at the only
lives.
gay bar in Allentown. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's where they have that official story. I'm not sure where that's the official story. So right off the bat, he sets up this straw man of, yeah, you know what the problem is? Nobody's ever written about, thought about, done articles about, written countless books about why the Germans turned over to the Nazi party. Nobody's ever speculated about that. Everyone's idea is that one day it was all strudel and lederhosen, the next day it was all zig, hail, and goose stepping, and then they recovered their senses. No, that is exactly how people understand that period. It's not like this is the most written about subject in literally human history, how the Germans became Nazis, how this sensible, cultured people became Nazis. But let's take a look at some rare speculation on this. This must be some recent revisionist history. Figures of reparation payments were adopted not only by the French, but by the British, which had no relation whatever to any process which exists or could ever be devised of transferring wealth from one community to another. To enforce submission to these senseless demands, French armies actually reoccupied the Ruhr in 1923. To recover even a tenth of what was originally demanded, an inter-allied board presided over by an able American supervised the internal finances of Germany for several years, thus renewing and perpetuating the utmost bitterness in the minds of the defeated nation. In fact, nothing was gained at the cost of all this friction. For although the Allies extracted about 1,000 million pounds worth of assets from the Germans, the United States, and to a lesser extent Great Britain, lent Germany at the same time over 2,000 millions more than she had paid. Yet while the Allies poured their wealth into Germany to build her up and revive her life and industry, the only results were an increasing resentment and the loss of their money. Even while Germany was receiving great benefits by the loans which were made to her, Hitler's movement gained each week life and force from irritation at Allied interference. So that must be, gosh, because he's saying nobody ever talks about this or tries to find a reasonable explanation for why these cultured people turn to Nazism. So this must be a very recent revisionist history. I was surprised when I looked it up to find this was actually written in 1935. I was doubly surprised to find out that the author was one Winston Churchill, who, shall we say, Mr. Cooper is not a fan of, as we will discover in the next segment. Anything, Keaton, before we move on?
Well, when he says he's not a fan of Winston Churchill, surely he's referring to the Bengal famine in 1943, right? Where he starved the Indians and then made fun of them.
Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World
War. Well, okay. Well, let's see.
Let's see.
I think he's getting to that.
I'm sure his chief complaint about Churchill is what a racist Churchill was, right? Because he was a racist.
That must be
sense. But Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. He was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. Look, they put
okay. So I think after this, he's going to get into that because, you know, the left has been criticizing Churchill for over 100 years. They still hate him in Wales because when he was the Home Secretary, he sent in the troops and he sent in the police to break strikes, to attack trade unionists. Some were killed. When he was the Secretary of State during the Irish War for Independence, he sent in what troops known as the Black and Tans. He advocated for the aerial bombing of Ireland. He had racial views that were not very much different from Hitler's. He literally believed that white Protestants were at the top of the racial hierarchy, that Indians were better than Africans, and so on. Not very much different. He did advocate for gassing tribal peoples who were rising up against the empire. He was to the right of even other Tories regarding releasing India and giving it its independence. And many people dismissed his warnings about Hitler because he had been so insane about Gandhi. He had been so vituperative about Gandhi that they just wrote him off as a crank when he started talking about Hitler.
He denied the Bengali famine because he said, you know, sneeringly, that if there were really a famine, why is Gandhi not dead yet? So quite the vile person. Quite the vile person, and I'm sure this guy takes issue with that.
Yeah. I mean, the left has been screaming about this for 100 years. So I was so excited to find out that Tucker was going to put on a historian who was finally going to delve into the reality of Winston Churchill and the kind of guy he was and take him to task for his virulent racism, which I think even today most people don't really know about.
Now, before we play this, I just want to say, you know, I hope he gets into that because in that first bit, it seemed like his biggest criticism of Churchill is that he fought the Nazis.
It seemed like he was going that way. I'm hoping this is going to turn around, though. Let's see what he says. This is about the Nazis. This is about the Nazi invasion of Russia. He gets back to Churchill later.
Yeah,
they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler's chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it. That when they went into the East in 1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You know, you have
well, they ended up dead.
You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months after, a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this, you know, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond, and you'd be crippled, and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And millions of people died because of that, right?
Just wow. All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. All right, so you heard that right. He is essentially putting forth the proposition that the genocidal war that the Nazis fought in Eastern Europe was an accident of logistics.
Right.
It was an oopsie.
Poor planning.
Yes, it was poor planning, that the massacre of millions of Russians in the end was not intended. Now, he quotes a commandant of a camp writing to them, and that may very well have been because a lot of the German army were holdovers from the tradition of a German army, and they saw themselves as duty bound to serve whoever was leading the state. In other words, a lot of the regular German army were not devout Nazis. So if such a letter were written, it did not reflect policy. It reflected the fact that you did have some members of the army who did not understand exactly what this campaign represented or what was expected of them. Throughout this segment of the interview, it's a 2.5-hour interview that covers other subjects. This is really a half hour. If you look here at the way he's describing Germany's motives, as if their motives are not clear. Maybe you thought you had to go in because the communists represented such a threat. And that's another thing. He's constantly framing the Nazis as defenders of Western civilization against the communists. He doesn't come out and say that. Maybe you thought that this threat was so great you had to go in case they took the oil fields and so on. Now, it is really remarkable to me that this person is taken seriously as a historian after watching this. Now, some people have said they've listened to certain things he's done and enjoyed them. That doesn't surprise me. I mean, he's got charisma. He speaks well. He's got all of these different sources at his command that he mixes up. But what he's telling you here is completely ahistorical bullshit. So my question would be, are you expert enough in any of the subjects that he's covered, that you've listened to and enjoyed, to know if he was full of shit? Because I very much doubt that he's just full of shit here, but he's accurate other places. Although, who knows? Jonestown, he did 30 hours on Jonestown. There's no Nazis involved in Jonestown, so maybe he wasn't conflicted there and he was able to just go ahead and tell it straight. But if this is any indication, I would say, as much as you may have found other things of his entertaining, I promise you, a lot of what you came away believing from listening to this guy is complete and absolute and utter bullshit. And you should probably go get yourself a book on the subject by somebody whose qualifications is not being the best read guy at the local tavern. Every town has a guy like this who's read just enough to be able to impress people who haven't read anything about the subject that he's talking about. Keaton, anything?
Well, I mean, that was pretty thorough. To me, it's pretty obvious that he frames, as you said, the Holocaust as an unfortunate accident. It was an accident. It was a mistake.
Right. It was an oopsie.
we meant these people well. We just turns out we didn't have enough food to feed them, so we thought we should just exterminate them. Yeah,
Oopsie.
Because that's the more humane thing to do.
Sure.
I mean,
it was a mercy killing.
It is outright Nazism. It's beyond Nazi apologia. It's outright Nazism.
Right. Not only is it Nazism, he's presenting this, and this is why I say you have to really just have no knowledge of the subject at all to take this guy seriously.
Yeah.
It just where he opens up, Robin DiAngelo very famously in White Fragility makes the absolute batshit claim that the way that people understand the story of Jackie Robinson is that he was the first black man who was good enough to play baseball with white people. And absolutely nobody understands the Jackie Robinson story that way. Everybody understands it as he's the first one they let play baseball with whites after this long injustice of people who were certainly good enough and better in many cases than white players were not allowed to play with them. That's the equivalent of what he just said at the opening there. Well, there's this idea that the Germans just, I mean, that's like saying, well, there's this idea that the American Revolution just kind of happened one day and nobody ever really talks about what led to it. What?
Yeah.
What? Like, you have to know nothing to listen to this guy and say, yeah, no, you know what? That's right. Nobody ever talks about why I never care about that. You got to literally have no idea what the fuck you're talking about to think this guy knows what the fuck he's talking about.
Of course. Of course.
All right. So here, because obviously he got a lot of shit on X, my contention is not that the Third Reich was peaceful or that Germany did not kill Jews. Germany dishonored itself by its conduct on the Eastern Front. My contention is that the war was not inevitable, that in fact almost no one but Churchill's faction wanted it, and that the atrocities could not have happened in the absence of a world war. This, I think, is not only supportable, but as close to provable as historical counterfactuals can get. Now, he got a lot of reader notes that you can trace back the links.
Yes.
They're not frivolous.
Right.
Atrocities against and mass murders of Jews, Roma, disabled people, LGBTQ people, etc. by the Nazi regime began as early as 1934. The Nuremberg laws codified this terror campaign in 1935. They were not the result of England declaring war in 1939. So now, if only we had sources that could settle this one way or the other. If only Hitler had let us know what he thought about Russia and war in the East. Oh, you know what? There's this book called Mein Kampf, where he laid out his thoughts on this and many other subjects very clearly. And so we National Socialists consciously draw a line beneath the foreign policy tendency of our pre-war period. We take up where we broke off 600 years ago. We stop the endless German movement to the south and west and turn our gaze toward the land in the east. In the east. At long last, we break off the colonial and commercial policy of the pre-war period and shift to the soil policy of the future. If we speak of soil in Europe today, we can primarily have in mind only Russia and her vassal border states. Okay, so he wrote this, 1921, somewhere around there. Okay, so maybe he changed his mind, as indeed Darrell Cooper, I think, realizing some of the contradictions inherent in his own argument, later suggests that by 1939, because the Trotskyites had been purged and Trotsky was dead, that Hitler had begun to rethink his intentions towards Russia. Well, that's interesting, given that they wrote up a plan for what they wanted to do in Russia in 1941. And anyone can go look this up online. There's a translation online. You don't have to speak German. So it was the Generalplan Ost. So let's look at some of what was in that. Generalplan Ost means Master Plan of the East, and was the Nazi plan for the resettlement of Eastern Europe with German citizens after their victory in World War II, which they presumed was imminent in 1941 when they developed the plan. 1941. The territories they were prepared to take over and occupy were Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and parts of Russia and Ukraine. Just like he said in Mein Kampf. That is something people always remark on about Hitler's reign. It was exactly what he said he was going to do.
But this is what I don't. Okay, hold on. I'm sorry to stop your flow. What's one of the most amazing things about this story is the fact that there are enough people apparently unaware of the fact that the Nazis' crimes against humanity predate World War II. Apparently, there are enough people unaware of that to the point where this guy can find an audience and find a followership. I mean, it's the most basic thing in the world, you would think, but apparently there are enough people who don't know that who could take something like this at all seriously. And I got to say, I do not include Tucker Carlson in the list of people who do not know that. This was an act of bullshit. This was an act of fucking bullshit by this guy.
There is no way that Tucker Carlson does not have enough knowledge of this period to know that what he said about the war in Russia is insane. It is completely insane. The Nazis believed people from these territories were racially inferior and required extermination in order to make room for the Aryan Germans. To exterminate the unwanted people in Eastern Europe, Generalplan Ost called for mass starvation or moving those they wanted to get rid of farther east. Nazi policy in relation to the Generalplan Ost stated, quote, many tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will have to die or migrate to Siberia. How people were to be removed, according to Generalplan Ost, was based on a racial hierarchy crafted by the Nazis. Those of Slavic origin were undesirable and were to be moved into Siberia. The Jews were to be totally removed, meaning killed. The rest of the people in Eastern Europe were to be enslaved, Germanized, or killed. The special German Einsatzgruppen task forces led operations to kill Eastern Europeans from the end of 1941 to the end of 1942. They killed over 300,000 civilians in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states alone. Hitler argued that he wanted to acquire Eastern Europe for the resettlement of Germans to the territory in order to give Germans Lebensraum, living space. The fact that he never mentioned that word in this entire segment talking about the motives for war in the East is amazing. Just amazing. This is what I mean. To listen to him and take him seriously, you have to know nothing yourself. Or everything you know has to have like the Stormfront imprint as the publisher. Like you have to just know nothing about this, or everything you know about it is just completely wrong.
Right.
The term was coined by the German geographer Frederick Ratzel in 1901. He believed a country needed enough resources and territory to be self-sufficient and to protect itself from external enemies. Okay. All right. And if anybody's saying, well, this isn't what's really in it, as I said, it is online. There is a translation. If you are interested, you can read the entire plan that the Germans had for Russia. The extermination of the population was not an oopsie. It was not a bug. It was central to their plan for that region. They did exactly what he said he would do in Mein Kampf. To continue.
British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no.
All right. Just to set this up. So he talks about how the Germans, and this part is true, but his angle on it is quite interesting. How the Germans had tried to made many overtures for peace with Britain. And so now he's picking up with after they invaded France.
You know, when
British
I look at
force.
Daryl Cooper, I'm reminded of when FDR called Churchill and said, "Tractor supply has fallen." That's what I'm reminded. Very sad chapter of the war.
Sad day.
And the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent. In other words, the war is over, and the Germans won. Okay.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you, offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this is what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. The whole plan was...
Okay, so it's basically saying, look, Hitler was going to spare the white people. He was going to spare Britain, so why didn't you just make a deal? Why did you fight?
Yeah, and He does have a valid point here that the British never tried to make peace with Hitler and had every reason to believe he would honor treaties. Let's take a look. Oh, okay. So at Munich, Chamberlain got an international agreement that Hitler should have the Sudetenland in exchange for Germany making no further demands for land in Europe. Chamberlain said it was peace for our time. Hitler said he had no more territorial demands to make in Europe. On 1st October, German troops occupied the Sudetenland. Hitler got what he wanted without firing a shot. 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops took over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh, it's almost like he couldn't be trusted. It's almost like the agreements you made with him, he didn't feel bound to stand by them. Poland seemed to be the next most likely victim of Nazi aggression, and Chamberlain made an agreement with the Poles to defend them if Germany invaded. Hitler did not think Britain would go to war over Poland, having failed to do so over Czechoslovakia. He sent his soldiers into Poland in September 1939. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. Okay. So, yeah, Chamberlain tried to make a deal with Hitler, and Hitler very quickly broke the deal. Did not stand by what he said, that his ambitions were finished, went and invaded Czechoslovakia. Then he knew that England had been bound by treaty to protect Poland. And he said, what are they going to do? So Cooper is saying that England should not have honored its commitments by Poland, and also that they had reason to trust any treaty that they made with Hitler. And beyond that, that taking his offer, where Britain, and this part is historically true, Hitler believed, because of his racialist views, that the British are Aryans, we're Aryans. The British have their sphere of influence, and we have ours. Ours is to the east. We're going to liquidate them. We're going to kill them all, as we just saw. They had a plan. They were going to take over the east, and you guys can be in the north. And it's all copacetic. Why are you fighting? It is true that Hitler didn't understand why they were fighting him, because he felt that, well, as Aryans, we should just divide the world between us. So he's saying that Hitler should have, Churchill, should have been good with that. He should have gone along with it.
Yeah. I mean, look, I appreciate the work you put into this. It goes without saying, no, you should not have taken the deal with Adolf Hitler. I mean, of course, like what, like, I don't even know what, I mean, I appreciate the effort, but like, yeah, no, Churchill should not have made a deal with Adolf Hitler. And to the morons, absolute mouth-breathing morons who read this as an endorsement of Winston Churchill, you have to think before you tweet. Because it turns out the irony is that the only thing that this Nazi, Darryl Cooper, doesn't like about Churchill is that he fought the Nazis. It seems to me that's the only thing he doesn't like about him.
Right.
He doesn't seem to have an issue with all of the atrocities that Winston Churchill committed. Most notably, in my opinion, would be the Indian famine of 1943. Not only did he really perpetuate that, but he basically joked about it in response. First he insulted them. He said it's because of overpopulation. It's because the Indians breed like rabbits. And then he said, well, if there's really a famine, why isn't Gandhi dead? Right. So, but I haven't heard, and look, I have not listened to all of this guy's brilliant podcast, so I don't know that he's never condemned that, but he doesn't condemn it here. It seems like the only problem he has with Winston Churchill is the one thing. Seems like the only problem he has with Winston Churchill is the one thing that could begin to redeem Winston Churchill as a historical figure, right? And I'm not saying it does. And yes, there are war crimes committed by the Allies, the firebombing of Dresden, that are overlooked in history generally. But this guy's problem with Winston Churchill seemed to be that he thought that the Allies should fight the Nazis and not make a deal with them, which would allow them to, as Russell just said, exterminate millions of people without consequence, not by accident, not because they ran out of food to care for them after they captured them. I mean, it is so fucking absurd. It is absurd. On its face, fucking absurd. It's psychotic.
Well, of course. And what's really funny is, again, demonstrating the ignorance of anyone who would take this guy seriously, at least on this subject. You have people telling people on the left when they're challenging this, they're showing Winston Churchill saying racist stuff. Oh, welcome to the party. We've been saying that the left is very well aware of Churchill's racism. They've been talking about it forever. They've been talking about it since he was still alive. They've been talking about it since he was prime minister.
Of course. And what's amazing is some of those people said, well, you didn't listen to the interview because here's the racist shit that Churchill said about India. Well, motherfucker, you didn't listen to the interview. Does he say any of that in the interview? Does he mention that? I mean, I'll confess, I only listened to what I assumed was the relevant portion of the interview, but the part that was time-stamped as being relevant to this segment, I listened to. I didn't hear any condemnation of Churchill's racist remarks. I heard bitching that Churchill didn't, lay down for Hitler.
Didn't agree to divide the world between England and Germany. And what he's saying, the war had been won by then. Well, clearly not, because we're not speaking German. Clearly he called it right.
Right.
To say that the war was lost is nonsensical, given that the war in the end was won.
Right.
He didn't believe it was lost, and he was right. Did he? Now on X, he did a whole thread, a lot of which got reader noted with sources, which is pretty funny. A lot of what he said as here is just completely untrue. And what he does say that's true as here is very distorted and slanted. He makes the point that Churchill basically went on a campaign to provoke the Germans to strike back so that the Americans would join the fight. Well, it turned out that was the right play, wasn't it?
Right.
I mean, unless you're Daryl Cooper and think that, the image of, people in drag mocking the Last Supper is a greater offense than Nazis in front of the Eiffel Tower.
Oh, look, in 100 years, Nazi apologists will begin each sentence. Say what you will about Daryl Cooper.
Yeah. In 100 years, they're saying it now. All right. So let's see how he continues to indict this foul way that Winston Churchill fought this war.
The invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. The whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war is over. We need either the Soviet Union or the United States to do it for us, and that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war.
Oh,
you are defending the Nazis by arguing that the way that Churchill fought was craven. Okay, well, let me ask you something. Is herding people into ghettos, is that a craven way to fight a war? These are the ghettos in occupied Poland here. Germany occupied Western Poland in 1939. Much of this territory was annexed to the German Reich. Eastern Poland was not occupied by German forces until June 1941. Ghettos were enclosed districts of a city in which the Germans forced the Jewish population to live under miserable conditions. Ghettos isolated Jews by separating Jewish communities, both from the population as a whole and from neighboring Jewish communities. The Warsaw Ghetto, established on October 12th, 1940, and that was, wasn't Norm Finkelstein's parents in the Warsaw Ghetto, I believe?
Yeah, speaking of...
You're such a fantastic moron.
It's so painful. It's so painful.
I would love to see a debate between those two. The Warsaw Ghetto, established on October 12th, 1940, was the largest ghetto in both area and population. There, more than 350,000 Jews, about 30% of the city's population, were eventually confined in about 2.4% of the city's total area. So is that a craven way to fight a war, Mr. Cooper? Is that craven? Because I don't hear you talking about that. When you did acknowledge atrocities by the Germans, you blame it on poor logistical planning rather than their very well-known racial ideology and plans for what the world would look like that Hitler had been writing about for decades, that very much fit what they were doing in the East. It's exactly what he said he was going to do.
Yes.
Okay, so to continue.
But I think his hostility to Germany was real. I don't think that he necessarily had to be bribed to have that feeling. But, I think he.
Okay, so to explain to the un-Nazi initiated, what he's talking about are conspiracy theories that Churchill was paid by the Jews to fight the Nazis, that it was not a sincere contention. So, as he often does on subjects like this, he decides to have it both ways. If you listen to his coding, the financiers and the media, he is indicating that Jews were behind it, but that his motives were sincere. That's not why he did it, but they're the ones who put him in power. So, to continue,
was to an extent put in place by people, the financiers, by a media complex that wanted to make sure that he was the guy who who was representing Britain in that conflict for a reason.
Okay, all right. So, Winston Churchill was the head of an all-party coalition. All parties came together in that government to fight the Nazis. It was seen as a government of national unity, not one faction. Now, there were certainly factions that were against Winston Churchill coming to power. Certainly the people who saw things as Chamberlain did, that war should be avoided at any cost. An unexplored element of why Chamberlain was so pro-peace and so many in his generation were, is he was a veteran of World War I. He had seen the horrors of World War I, and he was blinded by that to the dangers of appeasing Hitler. But, there was another faction that I guess Cooper is thinking of when he thinks of factions that didn't want Churchill to come to power. This is Oswald Mosley. Any fans of Peaky Blinders will remember the character of Oswald Mosley, but he was actually a historical figure. During the 1930s, Mosley led Britain's virulently anti-Semitic fascist movement, whose street fighters, known as black shirts, were notorious for their violence against Jews and left-wing opponents. He was on friendly terms with Mussolini, and Hitler was guest of honor at his second wedding. Oh, and that wedding took place at the home of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The British authorities definitely considered Mosley a threat. During World War II, he was interned as a suspected enemy sympathizer. It was widely assumed at the time that had the Nazis successfully invaded the UK, he would have been installed as head of a pro-German puppet regime. So we can't be sure who exactly he's referring to, who did not want Churchill to come to power, but certainly Oswald Mosley would have been numbered in that coalition. Anything, Keaton?
Nope. Go ahead. Play it. Let's play it out. As we say.
All right. So here's Tucker pretending to be stupid.
And yet Churchill has been positioned and has been really is accepted as like the defender of the West over the last 100 years.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's, and I wonder why that is. I mean, people can certainly take issue with any factual claims you're making. I assume they're consistent with what I think I know to be true.
Bullshit. Bull fucking shit. There are a lot of stupid people who sit in front of a microphone. Tucker Carlson is not one of them. I don't know what fucking game he's playing here. There is absolutely no way that Tucker Carlson is listening to this and does not know that this guy is completely full of shit. Completely full of shit.
No. The hipster edgelord from the Lumineers cover band knows the real story. And it's everybody who thinks they know something about World War II. They haven't listened to this guy yet.
Yes.
Don't you know that?
This isn't like you need to be an
This is the
expert in this
internet.
subject.
Yeah,
Like,
this is the
like,
internet.
like a bright fourth grader could knock down a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
So I don't know where he's coming from, why he's indulging this, why he has this guy on his show. Frankly, this is where you always have to remember. Yeah, Tucker can have a good take, but at the end of the day, he's in the lane he's in for a reason. He harbors certain beliefs, and maybe he's encouraging this because the kind of world that he wants needs historians who are going to rewrite history in this way. And I'll tell you, as Tucker, who I thought with some justification has always defended himself against claims that he's a white nationalist rather than just a straight nationalist. This is a pretty funny choice for somebody who's spent so many years trying to make that argument about their worldview to bring this fucking Nazi on.
But why do you think Churchill has been presented in the way that he has?
Yeah, well, it has to do with what you said earlier, right? Neville Chamberlain versus Churchill has been the binary model that has served as the chief rhetorical device for every conflict we've wanted to get into since then.
Yes.
The entire Cold War, and then even after the Cold War, in the global war on terror, is if you appease them, you're Neville Chamberlain. Churchill's the one who saw all along where this was headed and was trying to warn people, this, Cassandra. And finally, because nobody listened to him, the war ended up breaking out and we were forced to go stamp out this threat. And now it's a much bigger threat than it ever would have been if we just would have listened.
Do you mind if I pause this? I don't want to ruin your shit.
It's almost over. Just finish it.
All right, I'll play it.
Strangled it in its crib.
And it's justified every conflict, really since the Second World War. Everybody's the new Hitler, right?
Everybody's the new Hitler. You don't think the old Hitler is Hitler?
Right.
Daryl Cooper's quote book. Say what you want about Hitler. He wasn't Hitler. Let's stop pretending Hitler was Hitler.
Okay. This is what's very insidious about these kinds of arguments and figures like Daryl Cooper. There has to be something compelling in there to draw in an audience, right? So that's the kernel of truth in this whole thing. And this is what gets people who are angry, rightly, and resentful, rightly, to listen to this nonsense, because what he just said is true. But what he's avoiding is, we call that propaganda. It doesn't mean that the core premise is not true, that Churchill turned out to be right about Hitler and that it was a mistake to appease him, because then later on they had a much bigger problem to deal with. That's not wrong. It's that people in power, once an example, once a word, once a concept has that kind of power, they're going to use it to manipulate people to support their agendas. It doesn't mean that in its original context, that formulation is wrong. Just because people misuse accusations of racism, because as a society, we have come to agree that racism is a terrible thing. So when you see a guy like Bernie Sanders, who you want to keep out of power, you accuse his followers of being racist. That doesn't mean that the formulation that there is racism is wrong. It just means powerful people are misusing a concept that they know has a lot of social force when deployed. So yes, they do use that formulation. Everything he's saying there is true. Every person is the next Hitler, and we have to stop them. They said that with Saddam Hussein. They said it with Gaddafi. back, not this recent, not when they whacked him, back when Reagan was
Sure.
going after him, they were saying that. So he's right. That's an element of truth sprinkled into all this fucking nonsense, but he's completely misframing why they use that example and using the way they misuse that example to call into question the basic premise.
Okay, yeah. I mean, sure. But even beyond that, just consider the hypothetical of what this guy is suggesting. He's suggesting that had Churchill basically cut a deal with Hitler, right, and ended the war before it really got bad, that things would have turned out all right and nobody would have been able to warmonger anymore, because we would have had this example of, hey, look what happens when Hitler and Churchill brokered a deal for world peace. And now there's not going to be the ability to propagandize about the need to go to war anymore, because we're going to have this great example of what happened when these two arch rivals came to the table and made a deal, as if history would have been written that way, as if this would have been the last war ever
It would have been a
fought
better
had
world.
Hitler won. It
Right.
is such, like, listen, I commend you for putting this effort in. It's beyond what I could have done, because to me, I can't even think, I wouldn't even know where to start. It's just so absurd on its face. It's laughable. It's absolutely fucking laughable.
That is why my mother used to tell me when I would make her take me to a movie that it was completely inappropriate to take me to. She'd finally, as she gathered her purse, yell, "You're gonna be a lawyer."
Yeah.
You argue like a lawyer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, man. I think it's important, or I felt it was important, because as you could see from the reaction to our little post on X, there are a lot of people being drawn in by this fucking freak. That is why it's important. And yeah, not everybody will listen, but hopefully some people are getting suckered into this will. All right, so this is the last portion. I'm going to do a screen share here.
It was the one that I did about the Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe after the Second World War, and what
He's talking about the one podcast he did where he wasn't able to look at things from the point of view of the people that he was doing the podcast about. In this case, the Soviets.
they did in Germany and other places, and specifically Romania, which is, as far as I can tell, like so far after 30 years of reading history books, is pretty much the worst thing that ever happened. These prison experiments that they ran in Pitești and other places in Romania after the Second World War are that's not family listening. If you really want to,
The Soviets did.
yeah, the Soviet advisors were there. It was carried out technically by the Securitate and the Romanians themselves, but this was a program being run from Moscow, right?
Okay. All right. So he's saying that the experiments that the Soviets did on people, and this is true, it's true, in Romania, they were testing poison gases, trying to find a poison that would be undetectable, and they experimented on prisoners. That is true, and it's terrible, and it was an atrocity committed by the Soviets, surely. This is a man who has just spent a half hour arguing that Churchill should have made peace with the Nazis and that the world would be a better place. And he's saying that this is the worst thing he's ever heard of in 30 years of reading history. I guess that he never heard of the Nazi medical experiments. Briefly, during World War II, Nazi doctors conducted as many as 30 different types of experiments on concentration camp victims. They performed these studies without the consent of the victims, who suffered indescribable pain, mutilation, permanent disability, or in many cases, death as a result. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, which brought 23 German doctors to trial immediately after the war, prosecutors found 15 defendants guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 7 were hung. Here are some of the most notorious experiments. Now, we're not going to go through all of these, but just one of the most infamous, the twin studies. In an effort to find ways to more effectively multiply the German race, Dr. Joseph Mengele performed experiments on twins at Auschwitz in hopes of plumbing the secrets of multiple births. After taking all the body measurements and other living data he could from selected twins, Mengele and his collaborators dispatched them with a single injection of chloroform to the heart. Of about 1,000 pairs of twins experimented upon, only about 200 pairs survived. And speaking of poison, researchers at Buchenwald concentration camp developed a method of individual execution by injecting Russian prisoners with phenol and cyanide. Experimenters also tested various poisons on the human body by secreting noxious chemicals in prisoners' food or shooting inmates with poison bullets. Victims who did not die during these experiments were killed to allow the experimenters to perform autopsies.
Well, they
So-
ran out of food by accident, so they thought that would be the
that
more
they
humane
thought it
way
would be
to
the more
treat them.
humane
Yeah.
way to treat them. And that article also gets into how to see how people would respond to high pressure. They would put people into pressure chambers until their brains exploded. So so that's not the worst thing you read in 30 years, or maybe you missed that part the way that you missed the whole plan for the East that Hitler had been talking about since he wrote Mein Kampf. So predictably, he says in the beginning of the interview, this is like a sacred cow to talk about Churchill, and people might come after me. So intellect and great scholar that he is, he feels that now his thesis is proved by the backlash that he's gotten on X. The emotional incontinence of people upset about my Tucker interview is proof of my point about the sacred nature of the World War II mythos, and has done more to weaken the narrative than anything I could have said myself. So thanks, guys. I couldn't do it without you. You fucking moron. This is like somebody going on a show and saying, listen, when you say that black people had it better as slaves, it's like a sacred cow. People are going to come at you. And then when they come at you, go, see, I was right. That proves I was right. The fact that this completely sick, deranged, ahistorical, counterfactual nonsense that I spewed with a host who, for reasons we can only speculate on, didn't in any way push back and only sucked my cock through this entire fucking interview. I got backlash, so that's it. I win. I'm right.
Owned. Triggered.
Owned.
You're
Listen.
triggered. I win. Hey, I'm not upset. You upset? I'm not upset. It's like that scene in
No,
the
I'm rather
Sopranos when Paulie and Silvio go to the hotel, and the Hasid says, "What are you doing here? You embarrass yourself." He says, "I'm not embarrassed. You embarrassed? No."
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not embarrassed.
Exactly.
I'm not
I'm rather invigorated.
Yeah.
So listen, on a serious note, I just want to say this because we do have some viewers who are surprised that we had this take. I don't know why. I don't know what we've ever said that would indicate to you that we support Nazi propaganda, but I hope this segment has disabused you of that notion. Listen, let me briefly.
Yeah, some of you guys, I think Ukrainian Nazis are the only ones you hate.
Those.
Yeah.
Okay. In all seriousness, let's get real for a second here. Everyone who is anti-establishment is not good. Okay, the hippies thought that. That was why the hippies embraced the Hells Angels. They thought because the man didn't like the Hells Angels, that the Hells Angels were on their side. The Hells Angels were pro-Vietnam War. A lot of them were veterans. They were extremely violent. They were prone to gang. You can fill in the rest. When they finally stabbed someone at Altamont, people said, oh, just because the man doesn't like them doesn't mean that they're on our side. Just because somebody is hated by the establishment, that doesn't make them credible. What if somebody walked up to you and said, yeah, gravity? No, everyone could fly until Isaac Newton. He was in the Illuminati. And so would you go jump off a cliff because the establishment doesn't like the guy? When I went to Braga, George Santos was there. And you had all these people. I love you. Why? Because the media hates him. So he's not a joke. He's not a con artist. Is anyone that the establishment doesn't like right? Does that automatically make them right? Listen, thinking like that makes you as susceptible to absorbing wrong information as being reflexively prone to believe anything the establishment tells you. You need to be a thinking, rational person who takes in what you hear and evaluates it based on evidence. And yeah, it's tiring to do that on a case by case basis. But if you don't do that, you wind up, and I'm sure a lot of people who came back at us on X haven't really thought about this. You are such a knee jerk anti-establishment person. You're so knee jerk about getting on the side of anyone that the establishment doesn't like that you have been persuaded to defend the actions of the Nazis and to accept the framing that the problem with Churchill was that he didn't work with Hitler to create a more peaceful world. You have literally been led to make that argument in public. Okay, that's where being knee jerk leads you. So think before you get on board with something. Not everybody who's a hated by the man is on your side. A lot of them are just on their side.
I mean, was this guy even hated by the man? Did anybody know who this guy was? I mean,
I guess
looked at him.
apparently he came to prominence. I mean, we don't ride in those circles. Apparently, he came to prominence by jumping on the Stop the Steal thing.
I mean,
he jumped out in front of that parade.
I've been to a lot of coffee shops in Greenpoint, so he looked a little familiar. But
Yeah.
you know, I had never really heard of him. Yeah, I mean, it's almost too absurd to even comment on. But the last part of it, where Tucker asks him, "Okay, so given everything that you've said here, why is it that you know, people view Churchill the way that they do?" The irony is, the reason why Churchill is revered is because they accentuate the fact that he beat the Nazis and they ignore all of the other vile parts of Churchill's history. You guys do the same thing, except you hate the fact that he fought the Nazis. You're not critiquing him for any valid reasons. There are a million valid reasons. You could write multiple books on what a scumbag Winston Churchill was. Did they mention any of that in that half-hour segment? No. So the idea that, like, you're being edgy and anti-establishment by saying what? He should have made peace with Hitler? You're focusing on the same thing that the establishment focuses on. You're just expressing a different opinion. And by different, I mean an overtly Nazi opinion about that issue. You, too, are ignoring all of the legitimate critiques of Churchill, which are common knowledge. Like, all of this is like, I assumed that if a guy came on here and talked like this, he would just be laughed out of public life. But because Tucker Carlson has his new podcast where I'm red pilling everybody and forcing everyone to question everything they know about everything, that gives me license to do. And look, Tucker has trolled in the past. He brought on that guy who said he had gay sex with Obama. Now that guy was like a proven criminal liar, that guy, right? So that read to me as a troll. It read to me as like, okay, this is not really serious. This is tongue in cheek, but like, whatever. Like, you're not lying about the
I don't
Holocaust.
think that's what's happening here.
You're lying about having sex with Obama. This is different.
Right.
This is this is different. You are just, I can't even call it lying, because like you said, a lot of what he references are facts, but the perspective is just so unbelievably warped. And some of it are not facts. I mean,
some of it is just not
some of it is just not true, right? Like the idea that the Nazis didn't commit crimes against humanity until the war escalated to the point where they felt they had to, because they didn't plan accordingly to treat their prisoners humanely. I mean, that's just absolutely from outer space. I mean,
Hitler was a reluctant race warrior.
Yeah, I mean, it's too crazy to even take as seriously as We did, but
Well,
apparently we had
well,
to because a lot of people did. I didn't know. See, Russell gets himself into this stuff because Russell was made aware of this because he's the culture warrior, and so people started tweeting at him, "What, you got to watch this? You got to watch this? You got to watch this." I had never heard of it. I didn't hear of it until Russell told me.
And on the other side, the other numbnuts were tweeting at me. I wonder if you're going to cover this, or because of your audience capture, you're not gonna. I mean, look at our catalog. Like, do we look audience captured to you?
Yeah.
Is there anyone on the political spectrum that we don't do a segment where we're going to piss them off at least once a week?
Yeah. All right. So my serious point to close this out, and then we'll read super chats, and then we got to go to the Q&A because we're going to keep poor Jake up all night if we don't. So I think we should.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So my serious point about this would echo Norman Finkelstein. Norman Finkelstein says it's because my family was killed in the camps that I am pro-Palestine, that I am anti-Israel. It's
Right.
because of that tragic history
Right.
that I speak out on behalf of the Palestinian people. It's not because that stuff didn't happen or didn't happen the way that the establishment tells you it happened.
Right.
It happened by accident, right? No, it's because it happened. And, my stepmother-in-law was visiting a couple weeks ago. And, my father-in-law asked, who are you voting for? No, I'm sorry. She asked who I'm voting for. My father-in-law knows me better enough to know I'm not voting for anybody. But she asked who am I voting for. And I said, neither. I said, I can't vote for anybody who gives Israel money or would give Israel money, given what they're doing. And she said, she's kind of an apolitical person. But she said, she says very kind of innocently, she says, I'm really surprised at the Jewish people that they would treat other people this way, given how badly they've been treated. You'd think they would know better than to treat people this way. Again, it's not a very political person, but that's a pretty profound statement from someone who doesn't follow politics that closely. And I said, yeah, you're right. You're right. So it's because of that tragic past that I feel compelled to speak out on the Israel-Gaza issue the way I do. It's not because that tragic past is a lie that you've been told by everyone. And this guy who no one ever heard of, who dresses like, the fucking assistant manager at a mulch store, he knows he knows the real history. And you're all just blue-pilled if you don't think of it. It's just absolute nonsense. It's dismissible out of hand. Like, why the fuck would I bother? I mean, I don't know why you bothered putting all that together, but it's good you did. But who cares about this guy? Who gives a fuck about this guy? Why
a lot
would
of people.
Anybody
a lot
care
of people.
about this guy?
He was the number one podcast on iTunes. Now apparently he dropped to number 3. So a lot of people.
It's
and
amazing.
hey, as well-known 2 live Jews in this space, we have a special obligation to speak out on this, especially because we know that sometimes you get anti-Semites who like to watch us because they think because we're speaking out about Israel, we're confirming their views, and they assume that we're down with shit like this. That's the only reason I could imagine anyone would be surprised that we have to take on this that we do. You must think that we're anti-Semitic, we're self-hating Jews. That's not what it is. As Keaton just said, we don't deny the Holocaust. We're speaking out because of the Holocaust, because we don't want to see a Holocaust committed against another people. And as I said earlier, and I just want to reiterate, some people were saying they enjoyed this series and once again I ask you, do you know enough about that subject where you enjoyed a series by this creator that you would know if what you were being told is true? Because I don't think it's very likely that someone could have a take that is this completely divorced from reality on one subject and have fidelity to reality on other subjects. Look, I used to watch John Oliver, and some people say, yeah, he just did a good segment on Medicaid, and that may be true or maybe not be true. But speaking of Jill Stein, after his segment on Jill Stein, I never watched him again because I knew how untrue the things he was saying was. And I saw how much conviction he said it with, at that point, how can I ever watch him again? Because I'll never know what you're saying that's true unless I personally have as much knowledge as I had about Jill Stein to know that what he was saying was not true. Same thing with this. I mean, at that point, once you've seen, why would you listen to anything this guy puts out? But
Well, that's
I mean,
the other
that's
thing.
up to you.
That's the whole other breed of moron of, you got to listen to his podcast series. No, I'm sorry. You've had your 15 minutes of fame on the Tucker Carlson show. You made an idiot of yourself. I do not then owe it to you to go listen to 30 more hours of you. You had your chance to make your case and represent yourself on a big stage. You shit the bed. That's it. That's it. No, you're not worth my time. Oh, listen to his 25-part series on this. Well, you think I have your kind of time? Is that what you think?
Yeah.
You think I have as much time as you do to listen to 25 hours, 26 hours, you know? And notice this, it was timestamped at the beginning of this, the Israel-Palestinian conflict. They didn't talk about it at all in this podcast, as far as I know. They talked about it. He talked about the process of making his podcast. I still don't know what his opinion is on it. Right. So, yeah, I mean, that was quite something. All right, let's read these super chats. And by the way, I just want to say, because some people were asking in the chat, do you believe in free speech? Yeah, absolutely. This guy has the absolute right to say whatever he thinks.
Sure.
And I do not advocate for the deplatforming of this guy whatsoever. He should not be punished by any of these platforms in any way.
The answer to bad speech is more speech, and that's what we did.
Has the absolute right to say what he wants to say, and we have the absolute right to say what we want to say, and that's it.
Please clap.